Tulsa, Oklahoma. It wasn't always like you see it now. Just a little over 94 years ago, Tulsa, Oklahoma was the glory of black greatness, the golden age for the Negro, a black financial empire that the world has ever seen. Black Wall Street and the people who built it have been heavily underrated and overlooked by millions. Black Wall Street was one of the many black successes that have been ignored and swept under the rug. Just shortly after the Emancipation Proclamation, a group of Israelites got together and built a legacy. This legacy would ring out like a roaring lion for other Israelites throughout the Midwest to also build their black wall streets. Black Wall Street, former by name of the Greenwood neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where in the early 20th century, so-called African Americans had created a self-sufficient, prosperous business district. The term Black Wall Street was used until the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. The name has also been applied more generally to districts of Black American high school economic activity. Historically, so-called African Americans worked mainly as servants in Tulsa, where they developed their own insular society with its own economy. Black businesses clustered on the strip of land that would become Greenwood in 1905. When so-called African Americans acquired the land, businesses included a grocery store, barber shops, movie theaters, banks, and many, many more businesses. Doctors and real estate agents opened their own businesses. The neighborhood also had its own newspaper and schools. Black Wall Street was thriving at the time prior to the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. The violent incident, however, took a heavy financial toll on so-called African Americans. Many homes and businesses were destroyed. Moreover, following the massacre, residents of Greenwood met resistance to rebuild. Nonetheless, so-called Black American professionals and entrepreneurs slowly began to rebuild. Lawyers offered legal assistance to so-called African Americans jailed in the massacre and helped them sue the city for compensation. A massive reconstruction of the district was completed in 1922. Only 1 year after the massacre and without the help of the greater Tulsa community. 80 businesses were opened by the end of 1922. The community thrived throughout the first half of the century, even during the Great Depression. In addition to the usual businesses, the area formerly known as Black Wall Street contained a business college and the reopened offices of the so-called African American newspaper. Many middle and upper class blacks lived there. In addition, it provided the backbone for greater civic and political participation by Tulsa's Black communities. By the end of the 1950s, however, more than half of the businesses had closed. Desegregation allowed the entry of businesses owned by whites, while increasing numbers of so-called African Americans in the community invested in entities outside of Greenwood. By 1961, 90% of so-called African Americans' income in Tulsa was spent outside the Greenwood district. The creation of the Greenwood Cultural Center, formed in the late 1970s, attracted tourism to the area. In addition to addressing so-called African American culture and working on creating more harmonious race relations in the city, the Cultural Center was charged with preserving Black Wall Street. In 2010, John Hope Franklin Reconciliation Park was opened in the Greenwood district. It commemorates the massacre and its victims, as well as noted historian and civil rights leader Franklin, who grew up in Tulsa. The story of the massacre is also told at Greenwood Rising, a history center created by the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Continental Commission. Unfortunately, integration would prove to be the nail in the coffin for Black Wall Street and many other Black Wall Streets across the U.S. For many centuries and generations, anytime our people began to trust in their enemies, it always led to our downfall. Before the Greenwood District was established, so-called African Americans came to Oklahoma in the mid-19th century as slaves of the 5 civilized tribes. The term for the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole tribes who were forced from their lands in the southeast part of the country, resettling in Oklahoma, then known as Indian Territory. After the Civil War, under the terms of the treaties of 1866, these so-called African Americans were emancipated with some integrating into the tribes, a relationship that would later provide freedmen with their own land. The relative wealth of some black folks in Oklahoma comes in part through their connection to the tribes and their land ownership, says Hannibal Johnson, historian and author of Black Wall Street 100. An American city grapples with its historical racial trauma. The Dawes Act of 1887 authorized the government to divide tribal territories into allotments for individual Native Americans, which included black members. As word spread that Indian Territory was a safe place for so-called African Americans to settle, between 1865 and 1920, more than 50 black townships were founded in Oklahoma. A wealthy black landowner named O.W. Gurley is commonly referred to as the founder of Greenwood, born to freed slaves in Alabama. Gurley was raised in Arkansas and moved to Oklahoma during the Oklahoma Land Rush of 1889. After running a general store in Perry, Oklahoma, Gurley, a serial entrepreneur, moved to oil-rich Tulsa and reportedly purchased 40 acres of land on the north side of the city with the vision of selling residential and commercial plots to so-called African Americans. Gurley wasted no time, opening a rooming house, purchasing buildings, and providing loans to help other black people start their own businesses. There was another entrepreneur that shared Gurley's dream of Greenwood becoming a self-reliant enclave for black Tulsans. The name J.B. Stratford, son of a former enslaved man, was a lawyer from Kentucky who owned pool halls, shoeshine parlors, and boarding houses before moving to Tulsa around 1899 with the goal of creating wealth in Indian Territory. Stratford invested in real estate properties and built the Stafford Hotel in Greenwood Avenue, a luxury establishment that was considered the largest black-owned hotel in the country, with 54 guest suites, a pool hall, saloon, and a dining room. So-called African Americans fleeing racial oppression deep south and those wanting to live in a city with more resources migrated to Tulsa's Greenwood district. A man by the name of A.J. Smitherman, whose family moved to Indian Territory in the late 1890s, founded the Tulsa Star, a black newspaper based in Greenwood. As the publisher, Smitherman was outspoken about discrimination and regularly informed so-called African Americans about their legal rights and called for black men, mainly in Tulsa, who served in World War I, to take up arms in response to white mob violence. A.J. Smitherman literally went to intervene in lynchings and other kinds of events throughout Oklahoma, says Johnson. He was an activist in every sense of the word, and Greenwood residents looked out for each other and supported black-owned businesses. In the district, there were luxury shops, restaurants, grocery stores, hotels, theaters, barbershops and saloons, pool halls, nightclubs, funeral homes, and offices for doctors, lawyers, and dentists. Greenwood also had its own schools, post office, bank, hospital, and a jitney service. Education also drew black families to Greenwood. In 1913, Booker T. Washington High School opened, hiring Ellis Walker Woods as its principal, a beloved educator who would serve in that role for 35 years. Woods, who was college educated, walked from Memphis to Oklahoma after seeing a flyer advertising for black teachers in Oklahoma. Simon Berry, a pilot, responded to Tulsa's white-only taxi service by starting his own with a Model T Ford, then expanding operations to include a bus line and later a charter plane service for wealthy oilmen. John and Lola Williams became some of the wealthiest black people in Tulsa. They owned the Dreamland Theater on Greenwood Avenue, along with a rooming house, a confectionery, commercial rental property, in a garage. Lola Williams was very much a partner in all the couple's businesses, and other women in Greenwood became entrepreneurs as well. Although wealthy black people lived in Greenwood, plenty still struggled, working minimal jobs and living in shanties. But the money they spent in the district helped build the community. All the black people that worked outside the district, particularly the domestics, the housekeepers, cooks, nannies, or the ushers at the magnificent Art Deco theaters or bellhops at the great hotels would get paid and then return to Greenwood with their money to keep the money in their own community so that they could build their own wealth. The Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, also called Tulsa Race Riot of 1921, one of the most severe incidents of racial violence in U.S. history. It occurred in Tulsa, Oklahoma, beginning on May 31st, 1921, and lasting for 2 days. The massacre left somewhere between 30 and 300 people dead, mostly so-called African Americans, and destroyed Tulsa's prosperous black neighborhoods of Greenwood, known as the Black Wall Street. More than 1,400 homes and businesses were burned to the ground, and nearly 10,000 black people were left homeless. Despite its severity and its destructiveness, the Tulsa Race Massacre was barely mentioned in history books until the late 1990s, when a state commission was formed to document the massacre. On May 30, 1921, Dick Rowland, a young so-called African-American shoe shiner, was accused of assaulting a white elevator operator named Sarah Page in the elevator of a building in downtown Tulsa. The next day, the Tulsa Tribune printed a story saying that Rowland had tried to rape Page, with an accompanying editorial stating that a lynching was planned for that night. That evening, mobs of both blacks and whites descended on the courthouse where Rowland was being held, when a confrontation between an armed black man there to protect Rowland and a white protester resulted in the death of the latter. The white mob was incensed, and the Tulsa Massacre was thus ignited. Over the next 2 days, mobs of white people looted and set fires to black businesses and homes throughout the city. Many of the mob members were recently returned World War I veterans, trained in the use of firearms, and they were shooting black people on sight. As the massacre escalated, angry white mobs got with the white pilots and had them fly over Tulsa over the black community and drop incendiary bombs over the black community, thus creating much fire and explosion and killing many black people. When the massacre ended on June 1st, the official death toll was recorded at 10 whites and 26 blacks, though many experts now believe at least 300 black people were killed. Shortly after the massacre, there was a brief official inquiry, but documents related to the massacre disappeared soon afterward. The event never received widespread attention and was long noticeably absent from the history books used to teach Oklahoma school children. In 1997, a Tulsa Race Riot Commission was formed by the state of Oklahoma to investigate the massacre and formally document the incident. Members of the commission gathered accounts of survivors who were still alive, documents from individuals who witnessed the massacre but had since died, and other historical evidence. Scholars used the accounts of witness and ground-piercing radar to locate a potential mass grave just outside Tulsa's Oklahoma cemetery, suggesting that death toll may be much higher than the original records indicated. In its preliminary recommendations, The commission suggested that the state of Oklahoma paid $33 million in restitution, some of it to the 121 surviving victims who had been located. However, no legislative action was ever taken on the recommendation, and the commission had no power to force legislation. The commission's final report was published on February 28, 2001. In April 2002, a private religious charity, the Tulsa Metropolitan Ministry, paid a total of $28,000 to the survivors, a little more than $200 apiece, using funds raised from private donations. In 2010, John Hope Franklin Reconciliation Park was opened in the Greenwood district to memorialize the massacre of the victims of Black Wall Street.